as the craft category continues to crowd, something we've been talking a lot about today, and as growth opportunities within the segment get harder to identify, we're seeing more and more craft brewery owners begin to look toward other alcohol offerings for growth. So in an effort to capture more drinking occasions, we've seen companies create co-branded spirits products, launch full-scale distillery operations, and expand into hard cider and introduce hard soda as well. Promiscuous consumers, eager to experiment with other forms of alcohol, are increasingly looking towards craft producers for these items. But like any expansion, a foray into another alcohol segment does not come without its own set of risks and challenges. There are numerous investment, corporate structure, regulatory, branding, marketing, distribution, and retail considerations that one must examine before deciding to pursue an expansion beyond beer. So here today to discuss that process are three individuals with a deep understanding of what it takes to branch out. Joel Vandenbrink is the founder of Two Beers Brewing and Seattle Cider Company. Brett Joyce is the president of Rogue Ales and Spirits, and Alva is an attorney and the chair of Pepper Hamilton's alcoholic beverage practice. So I'll bring all three of them to the stage right now. Come on up. And I think these mics might be hot up here, by the way, for our AV guys back there. You guys all mic'd up? You good? All right. Okay. Welcome. Welcome, guys.
Thank you.
Did you guys get some beers at lunch?
Yes,
Oh,
not too many.
Rehydrating now? So I mentioned it sort of in the introductory statements there, but we're seeing a lot of companies branch out and move beyond the beer category. And I think that, you know, we've kind of talked a lot about this today. Just with the growth slowing in craft, it's going to be, you know, increasingly important for companies to start to consider other ways to grow. And you know, Joel and Brett, you guys have done that or have been doing that for a number of years. So I'll start with you guys. What motivated each of you guys to expand your businesses into these spirits and cider spaces?
Yeah, for me it was. I started Two Beers Brewing Company 9 years ago, and then Seattle Cider about 3.5. So the first company was beer, then the second was cider, so I expanded into cider. And I saw a huge opportunity within my local market. Being in Seattle and Washington, where 75% of the apples for the nation are grown, and nobody was making cider within Seattle. And so I saw that huge gap, and then I also saw a price gap, where there was the kind of like cost-effective cider, and then the high-end, large format cider, but there wasn't anything in between. And so I was like, double opportunity. Washington State, huge craft segment to be capitalized on. I'm going to do it.
Awesome. And for Rogue, Brett, you know, what really drove you guys into branching out into the spirit space?
Yeah, for us it was a couple things, and we started making spirits in 2003. So at the time we were the first rum distillery in Oregon. So for us, anytime we can be first at something, we like that leadership position. And more importantly, what we observed in the spirits space was sort of a lack of what we were experiencing successfully in the beer space, which was we wanted to bring our innovation and variety and creativity. We just looked at beer or at spirits and said, hey, why can't we apply what we've done on the beer side over in the spirit side? And this is 2003, before there were a lot of craft distilleries across the country like there are now. So we had a chance to apply some of those learnings from beer and bring what makes Rogue, just transfer that into the spirits products.
Yeah, you talk about kind of trying to understand a little bit of how to transfer what you've learned from beer into spirits. What were the similarities and differences that you discovered as you did that between the spirits and beer categories?
Yeah, I think what we've learned over the years now is we want there to be more similarities, but as we learn more, it's very, very, very different. And so certainly there's some commonality. There's some distributors that carry beer and spirits. Whether or not they do that successfully, that's something else. Obviously, it's alcohol, so there's some commonality there. There's some crossover with respect to retailers. But then you get into the differences, and the list of differences is a lot longer than the list of things that are in common. So when you talk about the tax structure and the control states and just the nuance of how how it's sold. Like give you a simple example where you can get a beer, you sell a keg to a bar and then put a tap handle up, and a customer can come in and see the tap handle and ask for a pint. You get a bottle on the back bar, the work's just beginning. Like how do you get somebody to know it's there or know what it is, the bartender to have a drink, or it's on the cocktail menu? There's just a lot more steps involved in getting somebody to actually pull it or call for it. So the list of differences is quite long.
Well, I want to come back to that in a minute, but for Alva, this is something that you've obviously worked with clients on, actually getting into a new segment. So from a legal perspective, what are some of the things that business owners must consider before they actually decide to enter another alcohol category?
Well, I think it sort of goes back to the point that was just being made, that the first and foremost, that I think it's very attractive to think about, well, I already make alcohol, and so this is sort of a natural corollary for me to go into a new category. And to a certain extent, it makes sense, right? Because if you're already a manufacturer, your growth opportunities into another manufacturing tier are better than trying to go into wholesale or retail, obviously, because of 3-tier. But the problems are that you really have to understand that it's a different business. And so, for example, one of the first things that I start off with clients is, set up a different company, because particularly if you're thinking about spirits, because of the flammability issues with them and the insurance issues that go around making that product, that just from a risk perspective and a liability perspective, it's good to have them separated. But also you've got very different structures in terms of your route to market, for example. What are the wholesalers that you're dealing with? What do they look like? How do you deal with control states? And so just understanding kind of down the line how they're different is sort of where I come into the picture, and it mapping it out.
Yeah, and corporate structure was one of the things that you mentioned, actually setting up a separate entity. Joel, that's something that you guys did with 2 Beers and Seattle Cider. What were some of the specific challenges that you faced having run a brewery for a number of years when you finally decided to enter the cider category?
Yeah, so being in Washington State when we started the cider about 3.5 years ago, I was required by the Liquor Control Board to have 2 separate entities, which actually turned out to be a huge blessing in disguise, as Alva is kind of talking about, because what it forced me to do is focus equally on both. But that provided its own challenges as well. I had to learn a whole new regulatory environment because cider is taxed way differently than beer, and it's much more complex and nuanced. It's based on ingredients, it's based on carbonation and different things you add, whereas beer is quite simply just alcohol content for the most part. And I had to learn a whole new customer base. As much as I wanted to think that the cider customer was the exact same as the beer customer, there are overlaps, but there's a different split, and you're dealing with a little different customer. On the cider side, we found ourselves talking more about the health benefits of cider, whereas we didn't talk about that as much with beer. And so we're dealing with a slightly different customer. So we had to learn how to market to that new customer.
Yeah, and for Brett, you were talking about it earlier. Selling a beer into a bar, giving that bar owner a tap handle and kind of watching a consumer come in and just order a pint, vastly different from selling a hard alcohol product in and hoping that you get on the menu somewhere or be part of the cocktail program. What has that experience taught you about the beer category? Have you learned anything from having to go through that process on the spirit side that's then informed what you do with beer?
Yeah, I'd say this. I'd say that certainly it's taught us that you have to be really expert. That you can't, if you go in half-baked or thinking that just because you do this one thing over here in beer that you can do it also in spirits, it's just not the case. I think it's actually informed us on the beer side, like, hey, we need to, in terms of how we sell our beer to our customers, be it retailers, distributors, or consumers, we need to be more buttoned up and more expert in how we approach that, because we learn kind of the hard way on the spirit side.
Yeah. Joel, the Seattle cider business for you is obviously a very serious business, something that you guys expanded. Once it kind of caught on, you expanded that brand pretty rapidly and really focused on it. Brett, for Rogue, the spirits business, as you said, is kind of more of a hobby, right?
Yeah, I mean, I'd say it's, hobbies maybe not quite the right term. For us, it's an important part of our brand, although it's just a small part of our business. So for us, I guess I think about it this way. Fundamentally, it breaks even economically, and so as long as it breaks even economically, then it's a great advertisement for the Rogue brand. So I guess that's how we justify the fact that we do it and the resources that we put against it. As long as we're not losing money, then it's, I think, a great positive thing. And as long as what we're putting out there is of the same quality as the work we're doing on the beer side. So we work hard to make sure that the work we're doing because it has the same brand name, because it carries the Rogue brand, what we do on spirits has to be of the same quality and what defines Rogue on the beer side. They have to go hand in hand.
So what happens when tomorrow, because we're streaming this around the world, everybody is clamoring for Rogue spirits. If you wake up tomorrow and you've got all this demand for your product, do you go after it? Do you chase it? And how does that impact the focus that you have on beer, which is the core business?
Well, I think if the orders are coming in because of this massive viewership we have here, that's easy. I'm not having to chase that. But for us, our core business is going to be the beer business. So we're not really in the chase business on the spirit side. We're kind of the mentality of like, hey, if it's easy, we can do it. If there's low-hanging fruit, we can attack it. But we've learned how much different it is and how challenging it is. And so we're not going to be a huge spirits producer. I think that's, we've decided that.
Yep. Joel, you had a totally different experience. Things really caught on with Seattle Cider, and you guys sort of made a conscious decision to really go after it. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so the cider is about 3.5 times the size of the brewery, and it's only 1/3 the age. And so when we got into the cider, it was quickly taken off. We quickly identified that there was a need that we were filling within our local market. And it really kind of exceeded my expectations. When I wrote my business plan, I expected to get to where I got to in 6 months. On my business plan, I expected to get there in 5 years. And so it took off, and so it took a lot of attention. I was undercapitalized at the beginning because I didn't expect to need to buy all the kegs and all the tanks and have all the staff and everything you need to do to sort of keep up with that demand. And so it took a lot of attention to pay attention to whatever sort of bottleneck next presented itself. I had to focus on that while keeping the brewery going as well and having that continue to grow in the local market. And so it had its own set of challenges to kind of bounce between the two.
Yeah. Is this something that you discuss with clients, Alva? Like what happens if this new project that I've launched takes off? What do I do next, sort of thing?
Yeah, I mean, I think depending on what you're trying to get into. I mean, you think about spirits, right? We've referenced a little bit on the control state, right? If when you're growing a brand, you start local, and more laws, not just in beer, but also in spirits and in ciders, are letting you do tasting rooms, and so you start to build the brand there. But when you start to get into distribution, it's a whole new world. The first part of the distribution network is, most beer brewers are, they're concerned about franchise laws, right? As soon as you sign on with a wholesaler, a lot of times you're locked into that agreement, and there are not as many franchise laws in the spirits world. Cider's a little bit different depending on if it's categorized as beer or wine, which we can talk a little bit about, but you don't have that franchise law protection, but you're dealing with wholesalers of a size that you have sort of no negotiating value with. I mean, if you're dealing with Southern Glazers, that's their distribution contract is something you want to have, and it's a different sell point to get that share of mind. But if you get that, you're golden, but you don't have a lot of say there. And then growth in terms of supply when you're going into a control state, I think is one of the largest challenges. So for example, I'm in Pennsylvania, and to get into a state store system, because we're complete control state, you have to be able to show that you can put your product in over 300 stores.
Yeah.
And so how you get to that scale is a real issue. You can't do it incrementally in spirits in the control system in the same way that you can on the beer side. And I think those are some of the first challenges that I talk to clients about.
Yeah, I think that whole concept of the control states is a really big one if you're going to be, entering into the spirit segment. There's what, 17 control states?
It's 17. In some counties, some Montgomery County in Maryland.
So walk us through that process of how that works. If you're a new startup distillery and you want to actually enter a control state, what's that process like of actually getting in and getting approved and starting to sell some product?
Right. So just like in everything in alcohol, every state is different. I'll just use Pennsylvania as an example because it's where I'm from, but it's also the largest purchaser of spirits. So if you get into that state source system, it actually really matters. There's a process where you submit your brand, and they have specialists who are going to look at it, and they're going to look at not just quality issues, but they're also looking at it from a real retail perspective. How much vodka do we have? How is vodka doing? How is whiskey doing? Are we over leveraged on whiskey? And you're also competing with maybe preferential programs for in-state distillers, right? So Pennsylvania is another example, but it's not the only one where if you are out of state, you have to be able to service 360 whatever it is stores. If you're an in-state distiller, there's a special program where if you can only choose 10. And so all of a sudden you are not only having supply issues in terms of demonstrating that you've got good quality and what you're going to be able to do in terms of getting people in the state to want to buy your brand, but you're also going up against sort of a competitor that you can't quite deal with on the local side. And on the flip side, if you're local, then that's to your advantage, and it's a way that the control states are trying to deal with that.
Yeah. All of this sounds like it just requires a ton of investment up front, if you're even going to consider this kind of a move. Joel, walk us through, kind of your process of going out and raising the funds necessary to launch Seattle Cider. You said you were undercapitalized to begin with, and then kind of how you continued investing in the business as it grew.
Yeah, so for me, I financed it all through equity financing. When I started the cidery, the brewery was at a point where it was, we were constantly growing, but every penny still definitely had to go back into the business. And so there was no way in which I was going to dip into that well to kind of start Seattle Cider. And so I put together a separate business plan, went out and got some of the same investors as Two Beers Brewing Company, but a lot different investors, different group of people interested in a different product, and pitched them on the idea. I raised what I thought I would need, as a lot of us have done over the years, and then you start and you're like, oh, I was way off. And so then went out and knocked on every bank's door that I could, found a really friendly local bank down the road from us that gave us a really good loan and helped us grow, and then we were able to go back to them and get more loans with them in the future.
Was that process easier having already launched another business prior to Seattle Cider?
It was way easier, yeah, because most banks look at the person. And so they looked at my history of running a business for 6 years, seeing that it was profitable for many of those years, and equated that sort of expertise and that skill set to Seattle Cider, even though Seattle Cider hadn't even been around for a year when it got its first loan. We were able to sort of use the history of the brewery to kind of piggyback for the cidery.
Yeah. So let's switch gears here a little bit and actually talk about some of the advantages and disadvantages of considering a move like this. What's at stake, what you risk, and even some of the innovation components within cider and spirits specifically. But I'll kick this one to Brett. What happens when you start, playing in somebody else's sandbox? If you're a brewer and you move into the cider space or the spirit space, what happens? What's at risk? Do you risk losing sight of the core business?
Yeah, I think that for us, that is the biggest risk, is the risk of distraction. And so we've worked hard over the years to refine and define exactly like what are we trying to do, why are we in this space, so we don't get distracted from the core business of selling beer. So we really had to work hard on making sure we're very clear internally before we can take our stories out to the world. And what you find when you go to somebody's sandbox, you find out in the spirits business pretty quickly how strong those other kids are playing in that sandbox. And it's just, you think like, hey, we've dealt with competition before in beer, but I will say this, it is very, very different on the spirit side. And the irony perhaps is that it's not often that brewers say publicly that we love franchise law. We have a strange relationship with this thing called franchise law, but in the absence of franchise law, which is what you have in spirits, then you really see what happens when the mega suppliers have so much power that they can exert over the wholesalers. So once we see that and experience that, I think we have a whole new respect for what franchise law in beer has allowed distributors to do in terms of carrying and supporting craft breweries.
Yeah. Joel, how do hardcore cider companies view a brewery that's trying their hand at making cider?
Yeah, I've had every response possible. To be honest, you've got the people who have been making cider, like orchard-grown, estate-grown cider that they've had, third-generation farm, who kind of look at my business model and they question it. And then you've got the brewers who say brewers can't make cider, and that's part of why we branded them completely different, was to escape some of that potential negativity. And so I've really had comments sort of all over the board.
Yeah. And I sort of briefly mentioned the innovation component. Brewers, for the most part, have a pretty blank canvas when it comes to creating, new recipes, new styles of beer. It's really sort of whatever a brewery can dream up, they can kind of put it in a package and sell it. But specifically with spirits and to some extent cider as well, you're really limited in what you're able to do and what you're able to call things, how you're able to label things. And I think that might, in some ways, kind of stifle the innovation a little bit. So how have you guys worked through those challenges to kind of tap into that creativity that you have as brewers and put it into a spirits product or put it into a cider product?
I mean, for us, and I think you're 100% right, the guidelines for products and spirits are much more defined and stringent than in beer. I think that's also part of the reason why craft spirits hasn't, even though there are a lot more of them out there, that it still hasn't taken off like craft beer. And I think part of that's because the product guidelines are very clear and defined, and the big guys do a really good job of playing effectively in those categories. So that's clearly a factor. And for us, we just have to, you're not going to change TTB's mind and change the rules, so you have to play within the rules you're given. And for us, it's a creative process of trying to figure out, like, hey, how can we take a product and twist it in a creative way that's within style guidelines. So for an example, gin has to have, by definition, juniper in it, and we have a gin that uses Oregon spruce. So I think there's ways you can take local ingredients and some ideas that you might have applied to beer and twist them into spirits. You just have to be a little, I think, more creative with how you do that because the styles are so tight.
Yeah. Joel, how have you guys gone about it? Because in cider, there's all sorts of tax implications as well. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so our creativity is really only stifled by the odd cider taxation laws that are out there. For example, if we add anything other than apples, like if we add another fruit to it, then it gets taxed more. If we carbonate it above a certain level, then it's actually taxed as a champagne. And so as we develop our recipes, we have to pay special attention to what's going in to the cider to make sure we don't trigger a higher tax bracket. And so this is why we've came out with a lot of botanical ciders. We make basil mint, we make a gin botanical, we make a 3-pepper, we make an oaked maple. You won't see us making a lot of like the apricot, the blackberry type ones, because that's a different tax bracket.
Yeah. Is this a concern for some of your clients, like how they're going to stand out? It's you can't just bring a regular old gin or a vodka to market. I mean, sure, you can have a really slick-looking brand, but that seems like a tougher road to plow unless you're doing something innovative. So what's the feedback that you've heard from some of your clients?
I think it's very similar to what both Brett and Joel have said. It's when you get into particularly with spirits, it's so defined in terms of what you can do and what you can add and not add. And so I think that my clients do feel like they are struggling on the innovative side sometimes, and they're looking more to just have a very good whiskey or a bourbon or something like that. That's although actually most of them are starting with vodka just because it takes a lot longer to actually get sort of a barrel-aged whiskey. But they'll think about innovation in terms of barrel aging and sort of other pieces like that. But it is a real challenge, and it's very different from beer in terms of what you can do and what can go in to the product. And one thing I was thinking about also with cider is that there's all this confusion, and I think it probably goes to the reaction that you get: is cider beer or is it wine? And it goes to the tax structure, but it also goes to, like in Pennsylvania, we treat cider as beer. We put it through our beer distribution network. Yep. So I think you have to be very cognizant in a different kind of way that you may know the laws in your state and you may understand what that looks like, but for some of these categories, they look very different in other locations too. And so you have to, as much as you may know about what beer looks like, over your distribution network, going into that new category is going to have new challenges as well.
Yeah. We touched on it a bit, but the idea of marketing and branding these products, there's some very sophisticated brands in the spirit segment in particular. And there are some, expert marketing gurus that are out there getting paid large sums of money to develop some of these brands for entrepreneurs. So, for a Rogue or for a Seattle Cider as well, where do you guys take your marketing cues from, and how do you think about branding a product that isn't beer?
Yeah, I guess for us, the spirits and all of our products, frankly, are a vehicle or an expression of our brand and the stories behind our brand. So I guess the way we look at a spirits product, for example, we try to look at it and say, well, what story are we trying to tell the world? So like we have, for example, we have a couple of farms that we grow hops and barley and pumpkins, and so we take the barley from our farm and malts it and make a single malt whiskey. And so, so that's a way for us to tell the world through a product that we're farming and growing our own ingredients. And those stories play across beer and spirits together. So we just look for creative ideas that are consistent with what we're doing as a broader brand and try to share those stories through the product. Yep.
Yeah, and for us, when we look to expand new territories, we very much follow the beer growth trends. There's not a whole lot of data. There's a little bit of data, but there's not near as much data on the cider segment as there is on the beer segment. And so we had to utilize where are the good craft states, the good craft cities. And then once we got there, the way in which we differentiated ourselves in that market oftentimes was talking about how we make our cider with real ingredients. So our basil mint cider is real basil and real mint, compared to a lot of our competitors use concentrates, flavors, colors, high fructose corn syrup, stuff like that. And so we differentiate ourselves with our ingredients once we're there.
Yeah, and that's part of the messaging. How about the sales organizations behind these brands? I mean, are you creating separate teams to go out and sell these products? Are you leveraging what you've already built with your brewery organizations? How does it work?
Yeah, for me, where I have both of my products, which is in the Northwest, Washington, Oregon, and Idaho, I utilize my sales team to sell both of them as able. And my executive team works on both products as well, but the production teams are very much kept separate. And then we have some salespeople in Oregon and also in Illinois, and they just represent Seattle Cider.
Yeah, we have two dedicated salespeople to spirits. We have a national sales manager, and then we have one person in Oregon who calls on the on-premise sector. And beyond that, we have our beer team also sells the spirits.
Interesting. So, a couple final questions before we run out of time here. If you're an entrepreneur sitting in the audience today, or tuning into the live stream, I guess, how do you, if you're sitting back wondering, should I get into spirits? Should I consider another alcohol segment? What are some of the key things that they need to consider before they decide, to either do it or not? And I'll start with Alva.
Well, I think the first thing you have to do is just fully educate yourself. You know, I mean, I think it's similar in terms of strategies that we've been talking about today. You know, start local. You know, most of the craft brands, whether they're spirits, cider, wine, they're all going to start local. But you have to understand that keeping it separate from a legal perspective, treating it like a different business is really going to put you in a good place. But it is an opportunity for growth within an existing category where there are some real opportunities to leverage your existing brand and your existing networks.
Yeah, and I would say do it with passion and do it with vigor. If you kind of dip your toe in just because you want to add some cases or add some barrelage or add some dollars to your top line, it won't get you where you want it to get it to. It's too much work, and so you really need to do it with passion.
Yeah, and I would say figure out as you embark on it whether or not it's a brand extension or a business. Because if it's just going to be a brand extension, you would set it up one way. If you actually think you can make a real business of it, you would structure and set it up completely differently. So I'd be really clear on, as you start on it, figure out what you want it to be.
Yeah, and that's a good point. You know, thinking about it as a separate business, one of the questions that I wanted to ask Joel was, you know, just the idea that it could impact a future transaction, you know, should you look to actually sell your company, which is something that you went through at the end of this summer. You know, maybe you can tell us a little bit about how having the two different businesses either helped or hindered, I guess, the process of trying to sell the company.
Yeah, so I was contacted by a French farmer-owned co-op, obviously in France. Largest cidery in France, and they expressed significant interest in the cidery, acquiring the cidery. And I told them that I wouldn't even talk to them if they wanted just a cidery. They actually had to purchase the brewery as well. Took them a little while to get over that because they weren't looking for a brewery per se, so it complicated the transaction on the front end. But then once they warmed up to the idea and the fact that they could utilize me and keep me on staff, and working with them, it became kind of a benefit, but it was a challenge on the front end.
Yeah, certainly. Well, I think we're just about out of time. We did get one audience question, which is pretty good, probably best for Alva. I don't know if you're able to answer this, but it says, with the new Type 74 license allowing distilleries to sell over-the-counter, do you see California craft breweries expanding their brands into spirits in the next 5 years? They already have the brewery, they just need to add distilling equipment.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, I don't know, you know, so much about that, but, you know, essentially I think that any allowance to maximize what your existing equipment, you know, and being able to do it sort of out of the same facility, whether you're having to create separations or not, is one of the advantages for a brewer to get into distilling as opposed to a new craft distiller, because, you know, most craft distillers, if they're coming into it cold, you know, they're looking at, you know, $1 million or something like that. From a brewery perspective, you can already use your own bottling lines and a lot of that. And so I think that you've got a competitive advantage there, and having the over-the-counter sales is huge in spirits just as it is in beer.
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously a key part of the beer business these days, and maybe something to watch as, you know, more and more distilleries pursue that as well. Well, thank you guys so much for joining us, and I guess good luck to anyone getting into cider and spirits, because definitely sounds like it's difficult. Thank you.
All right. Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Chris.